The morning that changed the trajectory of galactic civilization began like any other in the sprawling corridors of Station Nexus Prime. The artificial atmosphere recyclers hummed their eternal song, maintaining the delicate balance of gases that allowed representatives from 47 different species to coexist in the same space. The Galactic Council chambers, a magnificent dome of crystalline structures and floating platforms, prepared for what the agenda listed as a routine session on trade route regulations. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Chen of the Terran Defense Force walked through the polished corridors with measured steps, his dress uniform immaculate despite the 18-hour journey from Earth's outer colonies. Behind him trailed Ambassador Elena Vasquez, the human diplomatic representative whose normally composed features showed the strain of the past few months of negotiations. Neither spoke as they approached the chamber's entrance, but both understood the weight of what they were about to attempt. For 3 years, humanity had petitioned for a seat on the Galactic Council. For 3 years, their applications had been politely declined, filed away in bureaucratic archives, or simply ignored. The standard response had become a form letter. While the Galactic Council appreciates Terra's interest in membership, current regulations require a probationary period of no less than 50 standard years following first contact protocols. What made this rejection particularly galling was the transparent nature of the real reasoning. The hegemony of Zarthak, the Council's most influential military power, had made their position clear in private communications. Humans were too volatile, too aggressive, too unpredictable to be granted the same status as the established civilizations of the galaxy. The fact that humanity had emerged from a single world to establish colonies across 17 systems in less than 2 centuries was seen not as impressive, but as concerning. The great doors to the council chambers slid open with a whisper of perfectly calibrated mechanics. The sight that greeted them was one of ordered hierarchy and ancient tradition. 47 seats arranged in concentric circles, each occupied by representatives of species that had earned their place through millennia of demonstrated stability and compliance with galactic norms. At the center, elevated above the rest on a platform of pure energy, sat the 5 members of the Inner Council, the species considered the most advanced and therefore most worthy of making decisions for the rest of the galaxy. Marcus studied each face, each alien physiognomy, noting the careful choreography of disdain and dismissal that played out in micro-expressions and subtle body language. The Veltar representatives, with their translucent blue skin and enlarged craniums, watched the human delegation with what could charitably be called scientific curiosity. The insectoid Kresh clicked their mandibles in patterns that their translators interpreted as barely contained amusement. The plant-like Silithy swayed in their environmental pods, their bioluminescent patterns flickering in what appeared to be synchronized mockery. But it was the Zarthak delegation that commanded the most attention. 7 feet tall, with chitinous armor plates and 4 arms each ending in razor-sharp talons, they had established their dominance in the galaxy through a combination of military might and bureaucratic manipulation. Their leader, Warcast Commander Threxisgal, fixed his multifaceted eyes on Marcus with undisguised contempt. "The session will now come to order," announced the session's moderator, a Veltar named Quintar, whose voice carried the weight of centuries. Today's agenda includes 17 items of standard business. We have also received a request from the Terran delegation for consideration of membership status. A ripple of what the translators rendered as laughter swept through the chamber. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but his expression remained neutral. Years of military discipline had taught him to control his reactions, even when every instinct screamed for action. Ambassador Vasquez stepped forward. "Honorable representatives, we thank the Council for this opportunity to address." "There is no opportunity," Threxgol interrupted, his voice a harsh rasp that seemed to scrape against the chamber's acoustics. "The Terran species has been evaluated according to standard protocols. They failed to meet the minimum requirements for Council membership. This matter is closed." "With respect, Commander Threxgol," Vasquez continued, "the evaluation protocols were established over 3,000 years ago when the galaxy was a very different place. Surely the standards can be reviewed in light of—" "The standards exist for good reason," interjected another voice. This came from Symantec Velnara of the Collective Intelligence, a species that existed as networked consciousness across multiple bodies. "Your species demonstrates concerning tendencies toward violence and expansion. In your brief time among the stars, you have engaged in 17 military actions, established colonies without proper environmental impact studies, and shown a disturbing disregard for established trade protocols." Marcus stepped forward slightly, and for the first time in the session, he spoke. His voice carried clearly through the chamber, enhanced by the translation systems but losing none of its underlying steel. Perhaps the Council would care to review the context of those 17 military actions. The chamber fell silent. It was unprecedented for a military escort to speak during diplomatic proceedings. Every eye, lens, optical sensor, and photoreceptive organ in the room focused on the human soldier. The first 3 were responses to pirate attacks on our colony ships. The 4th through 8th were defensive actions against Kresh raiding parties targeting our mining operations. The 9th was a rescue operation to extract Veltar scientists from a failing research station when your own ships were deemed too valuable to risk. Should I continue? Trexgol's talons scraped against his seat's armrests, leaving deep gouges in the metal. You dare. I dare speak the truth, Marcus continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the vast chamber with its intensity. Every action we've taken has been documented, filed with the appropriate authorities, and carried out within the legal frameworks that we weren't allowed to help establish because we don't have a seat at this table. A Silathi representative pulsed with angry red light. Your species lacks the philosophical development necessary for council membership. You are driven by primitive emotions and tribal loyalties that have no place in civilized galactic society. Primitive emotions, Marcus repeated, and something in his tone made several representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. Let me tell you about primitive emotions. He moved to the center of the chamber, and though he carried no weapons and wore only a dress uniform, his presence suddenly seemed to fill the space with an electric tension. 18 months ago, a mining accident on Kepler 442b trapped 67 miners 2 kilometers underground. The local government requested assistance from the council. For 3 days, we watched your ships arrive in orbit. For 3 days, we waited for your advanced technology and sophisticated civilization to act. The chamber remained silent. Your response was to establish a committee to study the cost-effectiveness of a rescue operation. The hegemony determined that the expenditure of resources outweighed the value of 67 lives. The collective calculated that the environmental damage from a rescue would exceed acceptable parameters. The Silathi Confederation decided that the miners' failure to follow proper safety protocols meant they bore responsibility for their own fate. Marcus paused, looking directly at each delegation in turn. So we went in ourselves, with primitive human equipment and our emotional, tribal loyalties. We brought all 67 of them home. This proves nothing, Trexgol snarled. Individual acts of 43 were Zartak citizens, Marcus said quietly. The revelation hit the chamber like a physical blow. For several long seconds, the only sound was the hum of the station systems. Trexgol's forearms went rigid, his massive frame seeming to shrink slightly into his seat. The irony, Marcus continued, is that you're right about us being different. We are driven by primitive emotions. We do make decisions based on tribal loyalties. We are violent, aggressive, and unpredictable. He looked around the chamber, meeting every gaze with unwavering directness. But the difference between us and you isn't that we're worse. It's that we're honest about what we are. Ambassador Vasquez watched in fascination and horror as her careful diplomatic strategy evaporated, replaced by something far more dangerous and potentially far more effective. Marcus had abandoned the script entirely, and she couldn't tell if he was committing career suicide or achieving something she'd never imagined possible. You want to know what makes humans unfit for council membership? Marcus asked. I'll tell you. We don't pretend that our advanced technology makes us better than our ancestors. We don't claim that our philosophical sophistication has elevated us beyond the need for courage or sacrifice. When we see someone in danger, we don't form a committee. When we encounter injustice, we don't calculate the cost-benefit ratio of taking action. He gestured toward the assembled delegates. Every species in this chamber has achieved wonders of science and engineering. You've built ships that can cross the galaxy in days, computers that can simulate entire ecosystems, medical technology that can extend life for millennia. And you use all of that incredible advancement to find more sophisticated ways to justify inaction when action is needed. A Kresh representative clicked aggressively. You oversimplify complex issues. Galactic civilization requires careful consideration of... Careful consideration? Marcus interrupted. Is that what you call the Sindarian genocide? The silence that followed was absolute. Even the station's ambient system seemed to quiet in response to the words that had just been spoken. The Sindarian genocide was the galaxy's great unspoken shame. 3 billion sapient beings systematically exterminated by the Malgorok Empire while the Council debated whether intervention would violate sovereignty principles. That matter was extensively reviewed, Quintal said carefully. The legal complexities of watching an entire species being murdered, Marcus said. Yes, I've read the reports. 17 months of debate, 43 subcommittees, 731 procedural votes. And while you were carefully considering the philosophical implications of action versus non-action, 3 billion people died. Threxgol stood, his full height making him loom over the chamber like a tower of armored fury. You have no right to judge this council's decisions. Your species has been in space for barely 2 centuries. We have maintained galactic peace for... Peace, Marcus repeated, and the way he said the word made it sound like an obscenity. You call this peace? A galaxy where the strong prey on the weak while the powerful debate whether it's philosophically appropriate to stop them. A civilization so advanced that it has reasoned its way out of basic moral obligations. He turned slowly, addressing each section of the chamber in turn. You want to know what we learned in our 2 centuries among the stars? We learned that intelligence without courage is cowardice. Technology without conscience is cruelty. Civilization without the will to defend itself is just elaborate suicide. The insult was clear, hanging in the recycled air like a challenge that none of the assembled delegates seemed able to meet. Several representatives began speaking at once, their words overlapping into a cacophony of outrage and indignation. But Marcus wasn't finished. You deny us a seat on this council because we're too emotional, too violent, too primitive. But every species in this chamber achieved its place through conquest, expansion, and the willingness to use force when necessary. The only difference is that you did it so long ago, you've forgotten what it felt like to fight for something that mattered. Enough! Threxgol's roar silenced the chamber. This human speaks of matters beyond his comprehension. The galactic order exists because we have evolved beyond the barbarism of our ancestors. We have achieved something your species clearly cannot. True civilization. Marcus smiled, and every being in the chamber felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's climate control. True civilization. Is that what you call it? He reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a small data pad. This contains the after-action report from Kepler 442b. Would you like to know what your 43 citizens said when we pulled them out of that mine? Without waiting for permission, he activated the device. The chamber's speakers crackled to life with a recording. Thank you. Thank you for coming for us. Our own people, they wrote us off. But you came anyway. Why did you come for us? The voice was clearly Zartak, a harsh consonants and guttural sounds, unmistakable even through the translation matrix. Marcus let the recording play for several more seconds before shutting it off. Why did we come for them? He asked the silent chamber. Because they were people in danger, and we had the ability to help. That's it. No committee meetings, no cost-benefit analysis, no philosophical debates about the nature of moral obligation. They needed help, so we helped them. Threxgol's massive form seemed to deflate slightly. For the first time since the session began, he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. Around the chamber, other representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some studying their hands, others finding sudden interest in the chamber's architectural details. This proves nothing, Semantek Velnara said, but the networked consciousness's usual confidence seemed forced. Individual acts of sentiment do not qualify a species for council membership. The requirements exist for sound reasons based on millennia of experience. Marcus nodded slowly. You're right. Individual acts don't qualify us for membership, but they reveal something about us that your evaluation protocols can't measure. He looked directly at the inner council platform. They reveal what we believe strength actually means. Part 2. The Philosophy of True Strength. The chamber remained suspended in an uncomfortable silence as Marcus continued, his words cutting through the political atmosphere like a blade through silk. What had begun as a routine dismissal of humanity's latest petition had transformed into something unprecedented, a direct challenge to the fundamental assumptions that had governed galactic civilization for millennia. Your evaluation of our species focuses on our conflicts, our expansion, our unwillingness to submit to what you call proper authority, Marcus said, his voice carrying a conversational tone that somehow made his words more unsettling than if he had shouted them. But you've missed the most important aspect of who we are. And it's the same thing you've forgotten about yourselves. Ambassador Vasquez watched the proceedings with growing amazement. Her careful diplomatic strategy lay in ruins, but something far more powerful was taking its place. Marcus wasn't just defending humanity's right to council membership, he was systematically dismantling the philosophical foundations of the galactic order itself. Strength, Marcus continued, isn't the ability to impose your will on others. It isn't the possession of superior technology or the command of vast fleets. Real strength is the ability to do what needs to be done when doing it will cost you something precious. A Sci-Fi representative pulsed with dismissive yellow light. You speak in primitive abstractions. Strength is measurable in concrete terms. Military capacity, economic output, technological advancement. The Council's evaluation criteria, Marcus interrupted, are designed to perpetuate a system where decisions are made by those who have the most to lose by making them. He gestured toward the assembled delegates. Every species in this chamber earned their seat by proving they could be trusted not to upset the established order. The real qualification for council membership isn't wisdom or strength. It's the demonstrated willingness to let others suffer rather than risk your own comfort. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several representatives began to speak at once, but Marcus held up a hand, and to their own apparent surprise, they fell silent. Let me tell you what we've learned about strength during our short time among the stars, he said. We've learned that the strongest person in any group isn't the one who never gets knocked down, it's the one who gets back up every time. We've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act in spite of fear. And we've learned that true power isn't the ability to avoid difficult choices, it's the willingness to make them and accept the consequences. Threxgul's talons scraped against his armrests again, leaving fresh gouges in the metal. Your philosophy is naive. In the real galaxy, idealism gets people killed. The Council's approach has maintained stability for people like you, Marcus said quietly. The stability you're so proud of is built on the suffering of those who aren't strong enough to protect themselves. You've created a galaxy where might makes right, but you've dressed it up in the language of civilization and called it progress. He walked slowly around the chamber's center, and despite the fact that he was vastly outnumbered and completely surrounded, every delegate seemed to lean slightly away from him as he passed. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. You hear that and think it means eliminating weakness, becoming invulnerable, building yourself up until nothing can hurt you. A Kresh representative clicked inquiringly. Is that not the correct interpretation? Marcus shook his head. It's exactly wrong. The weak self isn't your vulnerability. It's your selfishness. It's the part of you that cares more about your own safety than about doing what's right. It's the voice that tells you to look the other way when someone needs help, because helping them might cost you something. He stopped walking and faced the inner council directly. When you destroy that weak self, when you make the decision that some things matter more than your own survival, you become something that can't be destroyed by external force. Not because you're invulnerable, but because you've already surrendered the only things that can truly be taken from you. The chamber fell silent except for the ambient hum of the station's systems. Several delegates were clearly struggling with concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and survival that had guided their civilizations for millennia. This is absurd philosophy, Symantec Velnara said, but the network's usual certainty seemed forced. Survival is the primary imperative of any rational being. Your willingness to sacrifice yourselves for abstract principles is precisely why your species is unsuited for galactic leadership. Abstract principles, Marcus repeated, and his smile was sharp enough to cut atmosphere. Let me make it concrete for you. He activated his datapad again, and the chamber's holographic displays came to life with tactical readouts and stellar charts. 6 months ago, a Malgoric raiding fleet attacked the Kepler 438 system. Population 14 million, mostly Veltar colonists with a significant Sci-Fi minority. The system's defense grid consisted of 3 automated platforms and a handful of patrol craft. The displays showed the tactical situation in stark detail. 16 Malgoric heavy cruisers against minimal opposition, with civilian evacuation impossible given the numbers involved. The Council's response was to express deep concern and call for an immediate ceasefire. Marcus continued. The hegemony determined that intervention would risk escalating the conflict beyond acceptable parameters. The collective calculated that the cost of military intervention exceeded the value of preserving the colony. Threxgol stood again, his massive frame radiating barely contained fury. The situation was complex. Military intervention without proper authorization would have violated 17 different council regulations. Marcus finished. Yes, we know. We broke every one of them. The tactical display shifted, showing new contacts entering the system. 3 ships, small compared to the Malgorok fleet, but moving with purpose and precision. The TDS Indomitable, TDS Defiant, and TDS Perseverance, Marcus said, naming each vessel as it appeared on the screen. Combined crew of 437, facing odds of more than 5-1 against ships with superior firepower and armor. The display showed the battle in compressed time. The human ships used their superior speed and maneuverability to devastating effect, striking at the Malgorok fleet's flanks and withdrawing before the heavy weapons could be brought to bear. But the cost was evident. One human ship was badly damaged. Another showed critical systems failures. The Battle of Kepler, 438, lasted 14 hours, Marcus said quietly. When it was over, the Malgorok fleet was either destroyed or fleeing. 14 million civilians were safe, and we had lost 112 good people who died protecting beings they had never met, from species that had never acknowledged them as equals. The chamber was silent as death. Abstract principles, Marcus repeated, looking directly at Semantic Velnara. Every one of those 112 people knew they might not come home. Every one of them went anyway because they had destroyed the weak part of themselves that whispers, "Why should I risk my life for strangers?" A Silithy representative pulsed with confused blue-green light. But why? What did you gain from such sacrifice? The saved populations owe you no allegiance. Their governments provided no compensation. You received no strategic advantage, no territorial concessions, no trade benefits. The action was pointless, Marcus suggested, wasteful, irrational, incomprehensible, the Salafi admitted. Marcus nodded slowly. And that's exactly why you'll never understand what makes us strong. He gestured toward the assembled delegates. Every species in this chamber thinks in terms of cost and benefit, risk and reward, advantage and disadvantage. You've built entire civilizations on the principle that rational beings act only in their own self-interest. He paused, looking around the chamber with something that might have been pity. But here's what you've forgotten in all your sophisticated calculations. The moment you decide that your self-interest is more important than doing what's right, you've lost the only war that really matters. You've lost the war against your own weakness. And once you lose that war, everything else is just a matter of time. Quintal leaned forward on the moderator's platform, his enlarged cranium reflecting the chamber's lights. You speak of strength through self-sacrifice as though it were an unqualified virtue, but surely you must acknowledge the practical limitations of such an approach. Resources are finite, populations are finite. If you expend them recklessly in service of abstract moral principles, eventually you will have nothing left to protect anyone. It was a reasonable question, delivered with the kind of logical precision that had made the Veltar the galaxy's premier philosophers for over 2 millennia. But Marcus's response came without hesitation. You're right that resources are finite, he said. But you're wrong about what the most important resource actually is. He activated his datapad one more time, and the chamber's displays showed something unexpected. Recruitment statistics from across human space. After the Battle of Kepler, 438 applications to the Terran Defense Force increased by 400%, Marcus said. Not because people were inspired by glory or conquest, but because they saw what we had accomplished by putting the lives of strangers ahead of our own safety. The statistics were undeniable, scrolling across the displays in neat columns of data. But more striking were the video testimonials that began playing alongside them. Young humans explaining their decision to volunteer for military service. I want to be the kind of person who runs toward danger when others need help, said one fresh-faced recruit. My grandmother always told me that you measure a person by what they do when no one is watching and there's nothing in it for them, said another. I don't want to live in a galaxy where people suffer because it's too expensive to help them, said a third. Marcus let several more testimonials play before shutting off the display. You see this as waste. spending lives for no material gain. But what you don't understand is that every act of genuine sacrifice makes the people who witness it stronger. It reminds them what they're capable of becoming. He looked around the chamber, meeting the gaze of delegates who were clearly struggling with concepts that challenged their most basic assumptions about survival and civilization. The weak self tells you to hoard your strength, to save it for when you really need it, to avoid risks that don't offer clear rewards, Marcus continued. But strength that's hoarded becomes weakness. Courage that's saved for the perfect moment never gets used. And civilizations that prioritize their own comfort over the welfare of others eventually discover that comfort built on others' suffering isn't worth preserving. Threxgol's voice was quieter than before, but still carried the rasp of barely controlled aggression. Your words are compelling, but they ignore practical realities. The galaxy is not a safe place. Threats exist that require careful consideration, strategic planning, measured responses. Your approach of immediate action based on emotional impulses saved 43 of your people from a cave-in, Marcus interrupted. Saved 14 million beings from slavery or death. Rescued 7 Kresh science teams from navigational disasters. Protected 3 Silithi art colonies from pirate raids. He paused. Should I continue? The Zarthak commander's forearms moved in patterns that the translators interpreted as profound discomfort. Individual successes do not validate an entire philosophy of. They validate the most important truth in the galaxy, Marcus said, cutting him off again. They prove that the strong survive not by avoiding danger, but by facing it. Not by calculating the odds, but by acting when action is needed. Not by preserving themselves, but by becoming the kind of people worth preserving. He stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the representatives of 47 species, and somehow managed to make it seem as though he were the one in position of strength. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, he repeated. Not because he becomes invulnerable, but because he becomes something that transcends mere survival. He becomes someone who matters, not for what he takes from the galaxy, but for what he gives to it. Part 3. The Truth That Changes Everything. The silence that followed Marcus's words was pregnant with possibilities. For the first time in the chamber's recorded history, the assembled delegates seemed genuinely uncertain about how to proceed. The careful protocols and established procedures that had governed galactic civilization for millennia had no framework for dealing with the philosophical challenge that had just been laid before them. Ambassador Vasquez watched in fascination, as representatives who had dismissed humanity's petition with casual contempt now struggled with concepts that undermined their most fundamental assumptions about power, strength, and the nature of civilization itself. She could see the wheels turning in their minds, trying to find ways to refute arguments that felt increasingly difficult to dismiss. It was Quintar who finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the weight of centuries but also a note of something approaching uncertainty. Lieutenant Commander Chen, your words are thought-provoking, but surely you must acknowledge that good intentions, however admirable, cannot substitute for experience and wisdom in matters of galactic governance. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right, Moderator Quintar. Experience and wisdom are essential for effective governance. He paused, looking around the chamber. The question is, what kind of experience and what kind of wisdom? He activated his datapad one final time, and the chamber's displays filled with historical data spanning millennia. But these weren't the usual statistics about economic growth or technological advancement that typically dominated council reports. Instead, the screens showed something far more disturbing, a comprehensive timeline of atrocities, genocides, and systematic oppression that had occurred under the watch of the Galactic Order. The Sindarian genocide, which we've already discussed, Marcus began, his voice steady and clinical. 3 billion dead while the Council debated legal complexities for 17 months. The first set of images showed the systematic destruction of an entire civilization. The before and after satellite imagery stark in its brutality. The Klaxon slave markets operating openly for 47 years while the Council gathered evidence of human rights violations. More images. Beings in chains, families separated, children sold like livestock. The Zirion mining operations, where worker safety protocols were under review for 12 years while an estimated 2 million beings died from preventable industrial accidents. The pictures of mining disasters, chemical poisoning, and mass graves seemed to go on forever. The Malthusar plague, which could have been contained with immediate action, but instead spread across 14 systems because the Council needed proper authorization before implementing quarantine procedures. Medical imagery now. Hospitals overflowing with the sick and dying, mass crematoriums, entire planets under biohazard warnings. "Should I continue?" Marcus asked quietly. Frexgold's talons had stopped scraping against his armrests. In fact, his massive form had gone completely still, as though he were trying to make himself invisible. Around the chamber, other delegates showed similar signs of discomfort. The creche had stopped their habitual clicking. The Silithy had dimmed their bioluminescence to barely perceptible levels. And several of the smaller species representatives seemed to be trying to sink into their seats. "This is selective presentation of data," Symantec Velnara protested. But the networked consciousness's usual confidence was entirely absent. These incidents, while regrettable, represent complex situations that required careful consideration of multiple factors. "Complex situations," Marcus repeated, and his tone made the words sound like an epithet. Every atrocity in galactic history has been justified as a complex situation requiring careful consideration. Every genocide has been preceded by committees studying the legal implications of intervention. Every systematic oppression has been allowed to continue because stopping it would violate someone's sovereignty or exceed someone's budget or require someone to take risks they weren't prepared to accept. He gestured toward the horrific images still playing on the chamber's displays. "This is the wisdom of experience you're so proud of. This is the mature, sophisticated approach to galactic governance that you believe humanity is too primitive to understand." The chamber fell silent except for the quiet hum of the displays cycling through decades of documented suffering. Marcus let the images speak for themselves for several long minutes before continuing. "But here's what I find most interesting about all of these complex situations," he said. "In every case, there were voices calling for immediate action. In every case, there were beings who said, 'We need to act now before it gets worse.' And in every case, those voices were dismissed as emotional, impulsive, lacking the wisdom and experience necessary to understand the complexities involved." A Veltar representative shifted uncomfortably. "Surely you cannot be suggesting that emotional responses should override careful analysis. I'm suggesting that your careful analysis has a remarkable tendency to conclude that action is too risky, too expensive, or too complicated." Marcus interrupted. "While people die." He walked slowly around the chamber's center, and this time none of the delegates leaned away from him. Instead, they seemed transfixed, unable to look away from either him or the damning evidence still playing on the displays. "The truth you don't want to face is that your experience and wisdom have taught you exactly the wrong lessons," Marcus continued. "You've learned that it's safer to debate than to act. You've learned that it's easier to form committees than to take responsibility. You've learned that it's more comfortable to blame complexity than to admit cowardice." The word hung in the recycled air like a physical presence. Cowardice. It was the one accusation that no galactic civilization would willingly accept. The one character flaw that couldn't be rationalized away through appeals to sophistication or pragmatism. "You want to know what makes humans different?" Marcus asked. "It's not that we're more moral or more intelligent or more advanced. It's that we haven't learned to be comfortable with other people's suffering." He stopped walking and faced the inner council directly. "Every species in this chamber started out the same way we did. Young, aggressive, willing to fight for what they believed in. But somewhere along the way, you learned that fighting is dangerous. You learned that standing up for others might cost you something. You learned that it's safer to be reasonable than to be right." Quintar leaned forward, his enlarged cranium catching the light from the displays. "Are you suggesting that maturity itself is somehow a failing?" "I'm suggesting that what you call maturity is actually a sophisticated form of moral cowardice," Marcus replied without hesitation. "You've built entire civilizations around the principle that other people's problems aren't your responsibility unless solving them serves your interests." The accusation was so stark, so direct, that several representatives flinched as though they'd been physically struck, but none of them attempted to deny it. "And the truly tragic part," Marcus continued, "is that you've convinced yourselves this makes you wise. You've created elaborate philosophical frameworks to justify inaction. You've developed complex legal systems to make helping others as difficult as possible. You've built a galactic order that rewards those who mind their own business and punishes those who interfere with injustice." He gestured toward the displays, which were now showing footage from the Battle of Kepler 438. The human ships looked small and fragile against the massive Malgorok fleet, but their movements carried a deadly purpose that was unmistakable. This is what it looks like when you refuse to accept that other people's suffering isn't your problem, Marcus said. This is what happens when you decide that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the cost. This is what strength actually looks like. The battle footage showed the moment when the TDS Defiant took a direct hit from a Malgorok heavy cruiser. The ship's hull buckled and atmosphere vented into space, but it continued fighting. Its crew had to know they were probably going to die, but they kept firing, kept moving, kept fighting to protect people they'd never met. Your evaluation protocols measure everything except the only thing that matters, Marcus said quietly. They measure our military capacity, our economic output, our technological advancement, but they don't measure our willingness to die for strangers. They don't measure our refusal to accept that injustice is inevitable. They don't measure our commitment to becoming the kind of people our children can be proud of. A young Kresh representative, one who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, suddenly spoke up. But surely there must be limits. Surely there are situations where the cost of action truly does exceed the benefits? It was the question that went to the heart of everything they had been discussing. Marcus looked at the young being with something approaching respect for having the courage to ask it directly. Of course there are limits, he said. We're not suicidal, and we're not stupid. We don't throw lives away on hopeless causes, and we don't pretend that good intentions can substitute for competence or preparation. He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. But here's the difference between our limits and yours. Our limits are about capability, not comfort. We don't act when we can't help, or when acting would make things worse, or when we don't have the resources to accomplish anything meaningful. But we don't refuse to act because it's dangerous, or expensive, or politically inconvenient. The distinction was subtle but crucial, and several delegates were clearly struggling with its implications. The man who destroys his weak self, Marcus continued, returning to the theme that had run throughout his presentation, doesn't become reckless or foolish. He becomes someone who can make decisions based on what needs to be done rather than what's safe to do. He becomes someone who measures success not by what he gains, but by what he protects. He becomes someone who understands that the only real security comes from living in a galaxy where people help each other, instead of finding excuses not to. Threk's goals stirred on his platform, his massive form seeming to gather itself for one final attempt at maintaining the status quo. Your words are compelling, Lieutenant Commander. But words are not governance. Idealism is not policy. The galaxy requires practical leadership based on proven experience. The galaxy requires leaders who aren't afraid to lead, Marcus interrupted. It requires beings who understand that the greatest risk isn't failure. It's the risk of becoming so focused on avoiding failure that you never attempt anything worth succeeding at. He looked around the chamber one more time, taking in the faces of beings who represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization. Many of them looked troubled, uncertain, as though long-held beliefs were crumbling under the weight of simple but devastating questions. You want to know why humanity should have a seat on this council? Marcus asked. Not because we're perfect, not because we have all the answers, not because we're more advanced or more intelligent than any of you. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet conviction that seemed to fill the chamber. Because we remember what it feels like to believe that some things are worth fighting for. Because we haven't forgotten that strength without courage is just elaborate weakness. Because we understand that the strong don't survive by avoiding danger. They survive by being willing to face it when others can't or won't. The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable quiet that had marked earlier pauses in the discussion. This was the silence of beings confronting truths they had spent lifetimes avoiding, wrestling with questions that challenged the very foundations of their worldview. Finally, it was Quintar who spoke, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been wonder. Lieutenant Commander Chen, what you're describing isn't just a different approach to governance. It's a different understanding of what civilization means. Marcus nodded slowly. Ha 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 ha, that's exactly right, moderator. And that's the truth that changes everything. He looked directly at each member of the inner council in turn. You've built a civilization based on the principle that survival is the highest good, that avoiding risk is the mark of wisdom, that minding your own business is the path to prosperity. He paused, letting them absorb his words. But we've learned something different. We've learned that a civilization that won't risk itself to protect the innocent isn't worth preserving. We've learned that wisdom without courage is just sophisticated cowardice. We've learned that minding your own business while others suffer isn't prosperity. It's just elaborate poverty of spirit. The chamber remained silent, but it was clear that something fundamental had shifted. The casual dismissal of humanity's petition was no longer possible. The comfortable assumptions about galactic civilization had been shaken to their foundations. "So here's our offer," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for his entire species. "We don't want a seat on this council so we can become like you. We want a seat so we can help you remember what you used to be before you learned to be comfortable with other people's suffering." Ambassador Vasquez stepped forward for the first time since Marcus had begun speaking. Her diplomatic training had prepared her for many scenarios, but not for this. Not for watching a single soldier dismantle millennia of galactic orthodoxy with nothing but hard truths and moral clarity. "The Lieutenant Commander speaks for all of humanity," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was endorsing. "We're not asking for the privilege of joining your order. We're offering to help you build something better." Threxgol's forearms moved in patterns that the translators struggled to interpret, but his meaning was clear enough. "This is unprecedented. The implications of what you suggest would require complete restructuring of everything," Marcus agreed, "starting with the fundamental question of what the strong owe the weak and what civilization means if it doesn't include the obligation to protect those who can't protect themselves." He stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the representatives of 47 species, and somehow managed to make it seem as though the future of galactic civilization hung on their answer to a simple question. Were they willing to remember what they used to believe before they learned to call cowardice wisdom? The displays around the chamber had gone dark, but the images they had shown of suffering ignored, of injustice tolerated, of moral courage forgotten, seemed to linger in the recycled air. And in that silence, with the weight of millennia of accumulated compromise pressing down on them, the assembled delegates began to understand that they faced a choice that would define not just humanity's future, but their own. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. The truth of it echoed through the chamber like a challenge that could no longer be ignored, a standard that could no longer be avoided, a mirror that reflected what they had become and what they might yet choose to be again. In the end, it wasn't about granting humanity a seat on the council. It was about whether galactic civilization was willing to remember what strength actually meant, and whether beings who had learned to be comfortable with other people's suffering were ready to become uncomfortable again in service of something greater than their own survival. The vote, when it finally came, was less about humanity's qualifications than about the Council's willingness to qualify itself as worthy of leading a galaxy where strength meant more than the ability to avoid difficult choices. And in the hours that followed, as news of the unprecedented session spread across the galaxy, beings who had grown comfortable with the sophisticated compromises of modern civilization found themselves asking a question they hadn't considered in generations. What would I do if I stopped being afraid of what it might cost me to do what's right? The answer, for many of them, would change everything. Document classification, historical record. Sealed final note from Senior Archivist Zethkari. This document represents a turning point in galactic civilization whose full implications are still being realized. The human delegation's presentation challenged fundamental assumptions about power, governance, and moral obligation that had remained unquestioned for millennia. Whether this represents progress or dangerous destabilization remains to be seen. What is certain is that the galaxy will never be the same. End of record.